Access the Writer at Work, and this session is presented to you by DNA. We have 6 speakers this morning. Ahdaf Soueif is the author of the best-selling novel, The Map of Love. She has also written an account of the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, Cairo, a City Transformed, and she founded the Palestine Festival of Literature. Álvaro Enrigue is the award-winning author of 5 novels and 2 short story collections. His last novel, Sudden Death, won the Premio Herralde and is published in 14 languages. Colson Whitehead is the author of 9 books of fiction and non-fiction, including The Underground Railroad, which won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Kunzru is the author of 5 novels, including The Impressionist and White Tears. In 2014, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Yann Martel is a Canadian author of 5 works of fiction, notably Life of Pi, for which he won the 2002 Man Booker Prize, and the film version of the book, directed by Ang Lee, won 4 Oscars. And our moderator for this morning's session is Chandrahas Choudhury, the author of the novels Clouds and Arzi the Dwarf. Chandrahas also writes for a number of periodicals about literature, travel, and politics. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our 6 panelists this morning: Ahdaf Soueif, Álvaro Enrigue, Colson Whitehead, Kunzru, Yann Martel, and Chandrahas Choudhury. The session presented by DNA.
Hello, everyone.
Everyone's looking at me. One of the very nice things about being a writer is that, one of the pleasures of it is that you allow anything you do can be called work. But that is also one of the problems with it. And I think as writers we have always struggled with the idea that what we do is work and yet is not. Our families wonder what we're up to before we published our books. Often we do something else in order to justify being able to write and making the time to write. Colson, I know that you've spoken about being able to buy time to write. And behind that, then there is so there is the question of where in the economic system our work fits in. And after that, I think there's also the questions of method and process, which to me are the most interesting things about the idea of the writer at work. And I wonder, Yann, if we can begin with you, partly because I think of everybody on stage here, you have the biggest India connection. You came to India in the 1990s, and what you saw both about religion and animals led you to a vision for the life of Pi. And please tell us a bit about how your process has changed since then.
Well, actually, my process has not changed. Since we're talking about process, I'll just quickly describe how I came to write Life of Pi. So in my case, it always starts with some kind of idea, and it has to have breadth. It can't just be an anecdote. And so I come from a temperate, secular country where there are no gods and no animals. And then I came to India where there are lots of animals and lots of gods. And they live together very closely. There's a lot of, as you know, there's a lot of animals in Hindu mythology. Hanuman, Ganesh, every god has an animal transporter. Well, coming from a secular tradition in a temperate country, I was struck by those beings, animal and divine. And so everything I write is an attempt to understand something that I don't understand. And faith in 2000 was a curiosity to me. How can people still believe in gods after the triumph of modernity, after the triumph of science and technology and vaccination? How can people still believe in things for which they have no proof? So I was interested suddenly in the nature of faith. And very quickly I had this idea of this lifeboat with this animal and this tiger, which to me is a sort of a nice symbol for the living of a life. We're animals, but we aspire to a higher condition. And my process, which has been the same for all my books, is to have an idea that I like, and then do some research. So since I just arrived in India when I had this idea, I spent 6 months traveling around India, visiting mosques, temples, churches, listening to how Indians speak their wonderful English, taking notes, taking pictures. And this research gave me more ideas, which gave me more avenues of research. My tiger had to come from somewhere, so likely it would come from a zoo, so I might as well look at Indian zoos and think about zoos and that. So it's that process, and then in a practical way, as I'm doing this research, I write. And so, for example, for my latest novel, I have about 600 pages of notes. And then what I do is I print up those notes, I get a pair of scissors, and I cut them up in their, sometimes it's as short as a single word that has struck me. Sometimes it's something that will be several pages long. And then I put these in envelopes, label the envelopes, and then I lay them out on the floor, and that's my way of visualizing what the story I'm trying to tell. And eventually, when I actually start writing, I open up the first envelope, and that is the beginning of my book. So I actually happen to have 2 pictures. Can you put them up? And it's just totally anecdotal here, but I lay these envelopes out from beginning to end, and that helps me. It's some friend's attic. My attic wasn't big enough, so that's at the very left there's the beginning of the novel, and the vertical stacks are certain sections for which there are many aspects, and on the right would be the end of the novel. And so when I start writing, I just take the first envelope, and that's the backbone. Sometimes I'll have the same section written from many points of view, so I have to make them work together. Sometimes there's ideas that fail. So those are sort of the bones, because I can't just sit down and write 350 pages. I can't do that. And nor can I just start and spontaneously start constructing a novel. I think everything through. So when I start at the beginning, I know exactly what the end will be. So with Life of Pi, I started knowing chapter 1, the author's note actually, I knew exactly what chapter 100 would be. Because to just start and go, and I gather there are some writers, and maybe some writers here will do that, that would be like being an architect and told you're building a building, but not being told what that building is for, whether it's a hospital or a sports stadium. To me, form must follow function. So when I start chapter 1, I have to know what the last chapter is, because otherwise I don't know what to put in chapter 1. So I think it all through, and then I start on this thrilling journey called writing a novel.
I think those pictures were the best prep work that anybody has ever done on any panel I've done in JLF. That was very nice to see. Ahdaf, I'm going to ask you a question about language. Most of us, I think, if you wanted to make a division of writers, most of us write in the mornings. And the reason for that, perhaps, is that the medium we work in is something that we use all day long. It's not something that's separate from life, like music or paint. And a lot of us feel that our language is the freshest in the morning. But in your case, a lot of the work on your early books was done at night. And what kind of experience was that for you, to work at a different hour of the day from everyone else, and after having done everything else?
Hi, good morning. Well, it was a necessity because with the 2 novels, I had 2 small children at the time I was writing them. And I also had a day job. So basically, my day was to get up, sort out the kids, take them to school, go to my work, which fortunately was very, very near the school and home. So that worked for me, the triangle of home, school, and job. And I negotiated a deal where I left work at 4 o'clock, so I could sort of 4:05 be in front of the kids' school, take them home. And when I'd done everything I needed to do for them and so on, I could start work, I could start writing. So that would generally be about 8:30. And of course, by then I was like really, really tired. And all I wanted to do was go to bed. So I had a rule that I had to stay on my chair until midnight, even if I didn't write. And so I would stay on my chair till midnight. And generally by 11, you'd get your, whatever it was, 5th wind and start working. and then it would really sort of be happening, and I'd have to make myself go to bed at about 3 in the morning so I could wake up again at 6:30. And it was difficult to go to bed at 3 because my brain was functioning. So that was what I did for 2 novels. I can't do that. I mean, I don't need to, but I couldn't do that again at this age. No. That was a very young, energetic person who was able to do that.
Hari, please give us a description of your work process and from one man to another, how has writing life changed for you after you became a parent?
I'm very sympathetic to Ahdaf's story of sitting down at 8:30, absolutely exhausted. I mean, I have 2 small children. Before I had children, I don't think I understood how much time I wasted. I mean, I would be now every hour of writing time is extremely precious, and my writing by necessity takes place after I've dropped my son at school and can continue until it's time to sort of re-emerge into the family to do dinner and bath and bedtime. And then my wife is also a novelist, and I often end up, after the children have been put to bed, going back to our desks, and there's a quiet in the house. Well, hopefully there's a quiet in the house at 9, 10 at night, which allows me to do some thinking. And I was very struck by Yann's description of how precisely he needs to know the end before he can start, because I think I'm almost the exact opposite. I have an intuitive sense that some material needs to be together, and I have to write out into that and discover what the shape. I mean, I discover almost the classic story of the blind person and the elephant. It's that you discover what the shape of this thing is by doing, and at a certain point I have to step back, and then I make a plan that actually is not totally dissimilar to that, except with index cards and a physical representation of the structure that I can look at and manipulate and think about and change around. But certainly at the beginning, I often don't even know if it's a novel.
I think there's a good range here because some of us seem to work to very specific plans and some of us don't. And I suppose even when you do have a plan, there's a question of whether you write the story in sequence or, as in films, you write some bits first. And Colson, maybe this is something about your method that has changed. Did you perhaps, when you were working earlier, always write the story out in sequence, or did you write the good bits first?
Sure, yeah, we were talking earlier about organization, and like Yann, I try to do an outline before I start. I have to know the beginning and the end. The middle can be fuzzy, but I like to know what I'm writing toward, and definitely the last couple of books I've known what the last sentence is or what the last scene is before I started writing. And for me, that prevents getting halfway, if I outline for 6 months or 9 months before, I don't get halfway through a book and realize, this book is kind of a dumb idea, why did I start writing it? And so outlining sort of proves the viability of an idea. And I guess when I was younger, I would have like these set pieces I was really excited to write, show off my sort of postmodern chops. And then I did that for 2 books and realized that I would write all the fun parts first and leave all the hard parts afterwards. And so there's nothing to look forward to. I would have the last 6 months of the book just being sort of doing all the sort of heavy lifting. So now I write from the beginning to the end. I don't skip around. I don't go for that sort of easy pleasure of like the fun part. And it's worked out better, I think.
Álvaro, part of every writer's method, and which sometimes readers don't see, is that one writes either in response to or in dialogue with some other writer from the present or the past. And all of us write in English here other than you, and I meant to ask if there is somebody in the history of the Spanish novel to whom either you or other writers around you sort of work with or against in writing?
I like the against part of the question, but I will not answer it in a public space. Yeah. No, it's very clear. If you're a Latin American writer, you write against the boom all the time. No, you really don't want to show up like Garcia Marquez or something. Even when I published my first novel, my mom read it, and she said, "Wow, Alvarito, you write like Garcia Marquez." No, I almost shoot myself. I didn't. Anyway, no, I don't think that there is like a privative relationship with your language. No, your language is like a natural thing, and I could not write fiction in other language than Spanish. But anyway, my readings and influences and the things that move my brain to the mystery of sitting down to propose a theory of the reality in narrative key, you know, to propose an equation that would like clear a zone of the world through fiction. It's a weird job. You know, the things that start up that are not necessarily like Spanish novels written in Spanish. No, it can be songs, it can be environments, it can be music, and then if you write in Spanish, you have the always overwhelming like weight of the fact that the novel is an Hispanic artifact. No, it's an invention. The novel was invented to explain Spain in the early 17th century as it was fighting its way through a peculiar way of modernity in Cervantes' El Quijote. No? So that's a heavy load. No? I tend to think more in Moby Dick than in El Quijote, just because the El Quijote weighs too much on me, and that in that other life that I think most of all have, that in which we have a day job, I am a 17th century literature professor. So every year I teach the damn Quixote to these American kids that are not super interested on it. No? So my relationship with that novel, that is the first one, the last one, and the best one ever written, is kind of difficult. No? So I just suck from other sources many times.
A word that comes up a lot amongst writers who don't work at stories set in present times is research. And the further back the story goes, the more another word comes up, the archive. But reading your work, I don't feel that sometimes, it's not clear, especially in Sudden Death, whether the objects and characters from the 16th century are brought up in that book. Whether your research has gone to, whether the work of a research was to prove something factual about them, or whether you did that so that you could invent over and above that. For instance, that tennis ball, which is actually made of the Queen's hair, is that real or fictional?
No, it's fiction. It's fiction, but when the novel came, I have in Spanish, I have this legendary editor. No, my editor is like a famous, very respected, like godlike figure in the Spanish-speaking world. And in the presentation of that book in Barcelona, when it came out for the first time, and it came out with a prize, and it was a nightmare. He says, well, and there are these facts that we have learned. That is, for example, there are some tennis balls made with the hair of Anne Boleyn. So for a year, I had to book tour Latin America, just sustaining the line. No? Looking to journalists in the eye and saying, yes, those balls exist, which was a nightmare. I work with archives as I think as sculptors work with wood or metal, or is just material for fiction. No? What the novels tell is not true. Everybody knows that, but it's a way to proposing different connections in reality. No, I think that an historian and a novelist see the reality just from different hills. No? I just don't have to give mathematical demonstration of what I think about reality and the historian does. No? But at the end, it's a process of knowledge of the world.
Yeah, we don't have the same duty towards the archive as the historian does. I mean, you can, when I've used archives, I'm reading almost, for things that a historian wouldn't find central. I mean, there are incidental details. There are all the bits that wouldn't add up to a kind of narrative set of facts if you wanted to tell how things were. I mean, because often, you're trying to lie convincingly.
and there is the, sorry, but just fast. There is the insecurity. No? If you're writing about romance, you need to know how they tie their sandals, even if there will be not a sandal in the novel. No, you just need to know it.
Yeah, I mean, this last thing that Álvaro said about tying the sandal, I kind of ran into that when I was starting to work on Map of Love, that I thought, and this also links into the idea of process, that I thought when I began it, that I was going to be writing a novel about a sort of start of the 20th century love story, which is the story that eventually became Anna Winterborn and Sharif al-Baroudi. But I discovered as I started to work that there was so much I didn't know. I knew about the politics of the time, which was why I was interested in that particular period. But I didn't know if people switched on gas or electricity. I didn't know what they would talk about as they were eating, apart from politics. And you can't have your characters talking politics the whole time. Although, of course, that does happen in life, but it can't happen in fiction. So there was this issue, and that's why I went into a sort of heavy research mode, which actually lasted 2 years. And I had to sort of really pull away from it at the end. But I was thinking about the relationship to the archive. A responsibility that I found was that in Map of Love, all the characters, apart from the fictitious ones, are real. So they're people who were poets, the Minister of Education, some politicians, and so on at the beginning of the century. And so when I imagined them in a situation where they're just sitting around, having drinks, smoking, and talking, of course, there was no record of that in the archive because they didn't do it. But I felt that I had to be completely truthful to the persona that was in the record. And so basically, well, it's not that I wanted to, I actually didn't want to and couldn't make them say anything that was at odds with what they had, written or spoken about officially. So it was a question of sort of bringing that to life because they're in a different situation, but remaining faithful to what was in the archive. And I ended up with a scaffolding that I would say was very faithful to history, but the freedom within that was the freedom of my fictitious characters, who were bound by the scaffolding as we are bound by the actual world we live in, but who had their own kind of autonomy within that.
Colson, I wanted to ask you, when you wrote the Underground Railroad, of course there's the first superficial layer of research, which is, for instance, what was grave digging like in the 19th century. But was there also something in the work, in the preparatory work you did for the book, that showed you what kind of tone to write the text in?
Yeah, I mean, the variety of things. I always like doing research, and different books require different kinds of legwork. I wrote a book about the zombie apocalypse a couple years ago, and research for that was watching Escape from New York, Planet of the Apes, and Night of the Living Dead, which I do every year anyway, so that wasn't that hard. For Underground Railroad, I went back to original slave narratives from the 19th century, written by Frederick Douglass and Harry Jacobs. And then there's an archive of oral histories collected in the 1930s by the U.S. government. It was the Great Depression, and they're trying to get folks back to work, so they hired writers to interview former slaves about their childhoods in the 1850s and 60s to capture these stories before they died. And as Harry was saying, it wasn't stuff that would go into a history book, but for a novelist, it was a great trove of nouns and adjectives and verbs that hopefully make the book sound realistic to a modern reader. With the change in syntax, I think someone in 1850 wouldn't think my book sounds old-timey. But in going through these oral histories, and there are hundreds of them, and some are 2 paragraphs, some are 10 pages, and they describe the day-to-day life of farming or living in the master's house. What did they wear? What did they eat? And stuff that, again, wouldn't come in a history book. So for me, a lot of the research for Underground Railroad came from these first-person accounts and their range of vocabulary. And luckily for me, it's all sort of digitized. A lot of libraries have digitized all these oral histories. The more research I can do from home, the happier I am. If you leave the house, there's too many, what do you call them, people, and if I can avoid human interaction as much as possible, I'm really happy. So.
I want to ask all of you, perhaps beginning with you, Yann, what is the place in what is the writer's relationship in the work of composition to the other arts, whether that's music, painting, or film? Is this a source of inspiration for you? And are there very particular pieces of art that always lead you to that place from where you yourself can create?
I was dragged to museums when I was a child by my parents, and I always found them really boring. And then suddenly one day I woke up and I found that I loved art museums. So I love the visual arts. Whenever I travel to a city, so Delhi or Calcutta recently, the first thing I try to do is find an art museum and explore that. Yeah, I'm quite nourished by the other arts. I'd say music, visual arts. In fact, usually I don't particularly like talking about writing with fellow writers. I don't like shop talking because I'm not particularly interested. I'm interested in people who have a different creative vocabulary: choreographers, dancers, musicians, painters. It all feeds you. I mean, ultimately, the arts are in some ways connected. But just before we continue with the others, I want to sort of comment on what they were saying about writing historical novels and what Álvaro said about, the Roman sandal. I think any work of art is an exploration of some kind of emotion. And you have to get your facts right, just because there might be a reader out there who knows the facts, and you don't want that reader to trip. So you don't want to get the sandal wrong or some detail of vocabulary or technology wrong. But that's really not the essential thing. If you're lucky, your reader is factually ignorant but emotionally connected, and will forgive you or will not know that you've made a factual mistake. And sometimes you make them deliberately. I think of, for example, one example in Life of Pi. I have a science teacher who was an atheist, and I have a Muslim who's a very fervent Muslim, and they share the same name. And a number of Indian readers pointed out to me that the Muslim character's name is very, very much a Hindu name. And he could possibly be a Hindu convert. He could be a Dalit who converts to Islam to escape the stigma of being an untouchable. But that very likely, it would be very unlikely for a Muslim to have a Hindu name. And that was pointed out as a mistake. And as it happens, it was a mistake I made deliberately because I wanted to point out that we are multiple. We're not just one thing. And so we can carry many identities. Identities is very complex. And so I wanted in both an atheist and a believer to have the same name, to say that they could be either way, actually. Your fate is not dictated by anything in particular, be it your name or your morphology or wherever you're from. You can be many things. So it was a deliberate mistake I made there. And otherwise, yeah, you try to avoid those mistakes. My next book is on the Trojan War. And what's great there is I'm not too worried about too many mistakes because Homer made loads of them. The Iliad is full of anachronisms and full of them. Every page is an anachronism, and he did all right. So since I'm basing myself on a fiction, I don't worry too much about the accuracy of my fiction. Ultimately, you just want the reader to suspend their disbelief. Once they've suspended their disbelief and they've bought into the emotional connect of your story, you don't have to worry quite as much with the facts. As Colson pointed out, if someone from the past read your book, or someone said, of course they'd find mistakes, but you're not writing for people from the past, you're writing for people from the present moment.
I think Homer's lucky there wasn't like Goodreads and Amazon reviews, so he can't go out and, you would never slaughter 5 calves for Apollo on a Thursday. 1 star.
I suppose in practical terms, the art forms that I use most when I'm writing are music and photography. If I'm researching a place in the present day, the things that I would forget otherwise are the things I have to. I have to take a lot of boring photographs. I'll take photographs of how the sidewalk looks and shop fronts and telephone poles, just so that I have that stuff for when I need to describe a scene in a street. And I listen to music when I work, partly because I live in a loud city and quite a loud household, and I use minimal or ambient music that sort of makes itself, raises itself really, like, and just can kind of create a space for me to think in. I find that is actually allows me to concentrate more than the background noise of a household.
Well, in Map of Love, at the beginning, Anna Winterbourne, having lost her husband in the Sudan War, she goes for walks in the South Kensington Museum for comfort, and there she comes across the paintings of Frederick Lewis. And it is the paintings of Frederick Lewis that send her to Cairo and that enable the entire action of the novel. And it is the attitude of Frederick Lewis as a painter and a person in Egypt that kind of informs really Anna's attitude. But in a couple of things, in The Eye of the Sun, there's music throughout the book. There are quotations from songs, and I think it was a complete nightmare for my publisher to get the right to publish all those little bits of lyrics from all sorts of songs. And one quite wonderful thing that happened to me when I did a reading in Cairo, and actually it was for the launch of the next book, is that a young man gave me 4 CDs, and what he had done is he had recorded in sequence all the music that was mentioned in The Eye of the Sun. He'd given me the soundtrack of the book. And my last thing is that I learned that somebody had done a thesis on statues in The Eye of the Sun, and she'd sort of found out that there were statues everywhere, that they came at opportune moments, that they were all missing a limb, and I hadn't even realized that. So that's what the intelligent heart of the reader can do for a book and for a writer.
I do the music thing too. I have 3 children, 2 cats, 1 dog. That's a lot of noise at home. So I never write at home. There is no way. There's no way. And then there is the noise of the internet. You know, I really like baseball, and I really like soccer. And there you can see the first soccer match at 7 a.m. and connect with the leagues all over the world. And then if it's a spring or summer, you can mix it with a baseball game. So I stopped writing in a computer long ago. Once the sports moved to the computer, I had to leave the computer. So I write longhand, and you cannot write with the children around. They are too funny and too interesting and too curious. So I write in this very crowded cafe in New York City that is near a university in which I taught like 7 years ago. And I write there, so I have to wear headphones, because the people in the table next to me is having conversations that are generally much more interesting than what I am writing about. They become very personal. It's really exciting. So I insulate myself through music, but in a very like utilitarian and infamous way. You know, it's not that I'm using it. I'm just insulating about it. So I have a relationship with music. I am a melomaniac, a serious melomaniac. But when working, it's just a noise that will protect me from the noise of mainly my children and the dog. The dog is a mess.
I've wondered if the pleasure of sport, since you bring up football, the pleasure of sport for a writer is that the present moment is extremely intense, which is exactly the opposite of what it's like in writing. When you have to work very much, it doesn't matter whether you wrote a chapter out in the morning or in the night or at any time. But I also know that when you were younger, you worked in radio, Álvaro, for a radio show.
Yeah.
And there's that same pressure that when the button comes on and you have to say something, it has to be right at that time and at that time alone. I mean, you don't have the chance to revise in sport or on radio, but while working, it's very different from that.
No, it's completely different. Well, in India, everything is, the size of everything is enormous. So Mexico City, that tends to be a very impressive city. If you didn't grow up there in India, it would be like a regular city, no? But anyway, I did radio only in Mexico City. My accent is not good enough to work on this in New York. So, and the adrenaline of open the mic for a city of 22 million people, of course, only 14 will be listening to you, no? Or maybe 17 if it's, if it's like a good time, no? But anyway, there is this, the radio waves have this like ethereal penetration that becomes scary and very emotional too, no? So there is like an honesty there, no? That there is not in writing. In writing, you have time to think. I spend most of my writing time non-writing at all. You know, you are just, I don't know, procrastinating, thinking, going through notes that you will never use, etc. No? So the relationship is completely different. I think the radio is too exciting for a writer. I don't think it's a good idea. And it's something I did in my youth. No? It's like drugs. No? You should do it just when you're young.
Yann, here's a question for you. In every writer's life, unless you happen to be extremely lucky, there is a stage when you're writing but no one is actually waiting for your books. And there is afterwards another period when everyone wants to know when your next book is out and there's already an audience waiting for that. Does that make a difference to the intensity you bring to work?
In my case, what you've just described hasn't made a difference. I've had the luck, I mean, I have 4 kids, by the way, guys. I've got 4. And so the way I cope is I have a door. I have a little studio with a door with a combination lock, and they do not have the combination to that lock. So that door keeps out not only my children, but the world. And also I've had the luck of never being pressured. I got very lucky, first of all. And also, I don't like things, so I live on very, very little money. So when I worked on Life of Pi, to take that example, I'd already published 2 books. And they had quite good reviews, but very low sales. My first one was a collection of short stories, and after a couple of years, it sold 800 copies. You know, welcome to the world of literary fiction in Canada. And then my next book was a novel, and it sold, after a couple of years, 1,200 copies. But nonetheless, each publisher it was published, and it was published in a few countries each time. They gave me a little bit of money. And in Canada, we have the Canada Council for the Arts, which is an extraordinary organization, one of the best in the world. And they give you grants. So I had some grants. So basically, I lived on very, very little. I lived not quite like a sadhu. I wore clothes, but really, I lived on very little. I had roommates. I didn't have a car. I don't smoke. I don't drink. I lived on very little when I adjusted my lifestyle to fit what I wanted to do. And I lived like a prince. I mean, when you live a life of the mind, it's extraordinarily satisfying. And so those books didn't nowhere. And then I started this book called Life of Pi, which I wrote on no money in Montreal, and did some academic research at the universities, I was in India, and did some research there, went back to Montreal, did more research, and then the success of it completely puzzled me. I was astonished. But after all that noise of the success of Life of Pi, when I had to write another one, I just closed that door. Because, you know, as I'm sure all the writers here would know, the success of one book brings some external advantages, but it doesn't change who you are. You know, they might point out your strengths as a writer, reviewers and people on Amazon. They may surely also point out your weaknesses as a writer, and those won't change. You're not a better writer for having written a good book. You are the same person. So when the time comes to write another book, you know, you're perhaps slightly more aware of your strengths, but your weaknesses don't go away. So you close the door, and then you wrestle with your new book, and does this work? How do I fix it? You know, those questions are the same. And then you hope for the best, and you let it go, and you see how it goes. So for example, in my own life, after Life of Pi, which did very well, my next book, in some ways, did terribly. I had terrible reviews for my next book. It was a book that dealt with the Holocaust. And some people were not at all happy with what I was trying to do with the Holocaust. They're saying, well, you're not Jewish. You're not playing by the rules of Holocaust books. So I had some devastatingly bad reviews in the United States especially. But you know, art is a gift. You write something, you create something, you give it to the world. And what the world does with it, if it's whether 14 people who read it or a lot more, it's their business, not yours. And so in the wake of Life of Pi, I suppose my editors had expectations and perhaps some readers, but that wasn't my problem. So the last thing you'd want to do after a big success like Life of Pi is write a Holocaust book, because that's for many people a non-starter. Holocaust, they've been there, done that, they're not particularly interested. But it was something I wanted to write. I felt you have to write, you have to follow your muse. And so I wanted to write that book, and I did. And that it did less well as well, ultimately you have to let go. That's the great lesson in life, is you have to let go and just move on.
Before we finish, at least from me, I'm going to ask a question which any one of you are welcome to answer. But perhaps I can ask you, Ahdaf, and if somebody else wants to answer that, that's good too. What is the greatest happiness of a writer's life that people don't understand, sometimes even readers don't? A kind of private happiness of working.
I would say getting to the last page without getting hit by a bus. You know, if you can get to the end of a project without being struck by lightning or something terrible happening, that's pretty exciting.
Well, I mean, if you're asking about the greatest happiness within the writing life or the writing process, I guess it would be part of my process was that when I stopped working at 3:30 in the morning, I would print out what I had done that day. If I was lucky, it would be 3 or 4 pages, and I'd print them out and I'd lay them face down on the desk so that when I was coming back to my desk next day at 8:30, really tired and not wanting to be there, I would think, oh, you don't have to write, you're just going to edit. You've got 4 pages there that you can edit, and that's easier. And when you turn over the pages, if you find a paragraph that just really stands and that you don't even know how you wrote it, it's as if it was written through you, that is amazing. It's rare, but it's completely amazing when it happens, and it tells you you're on track. Yeah.
So slightly similar. I mean, I think within the writing, I've realized I'm most at peace in the world when I'm solving a problem in a sentence or a paragraph. I'm actually turning words over, and I realize I've forgotten everything else outside the work. And that, when the work becomes a kind of meditation, and that's when it feels best and feels most worth doing to me.
I go to the category meditation, a fever too. No? There is I write longhand, and then I go to the computer, and that's when the real writing happens. No? And usually it's just a job. No? But there are days in which you are just jamming there, no? In which just get the rhythm and keep going and going. And that's happiness. No, that's absolute happiness when you just get it. No, it doesn't happen very often, but happens.
The thing I like most about writing is, first of all, the materiality of it. If you're a writer, you obviously like language, you like words. And I'm not saying that that I necessarily have an immense vocabulary or a scintillating style. It's just you have to love the language, the words. And so I find there's a pleasure at many, many levels. The pleasure of vocabulary, of finding the right word at the right point in a sentence, the pleasures of getting a sentence what you feel is right. This is all delusions, of course. You're happy with what you're doing, and then other people will say, oh, this is terrible. But the point is, you are yourself happy with it. In dialogue with yourself, you're happy with what you're doing. So there's all those stylistic and linguistic pleasures. And then once you've finished, I know what Colson's saying, when I'm happy with the book, I am terribly afraid of dying, because I figure I can only die once I finish this, because it would be really tragic, beyond the loss of my life, if I didn't finish this novel, because it's such a beautiful thing. You know, to me, a book is not the printed thing. It's this idea in my head. It's this magic mountain floating in my head. And at the end of the process, there are these pages with text on it. But that's kind of something strange. It's something else. And the thing is really this thing floating in my head magically. And then once you've finished it, and you mentioned the word luck, and I think luck plays such a huge role in it. Once you have the book out, the greatest pleasure is when it connects with readers. Obviously, prizes are nice, and not being poor is nice. But the true satisfaction is that connection. After all, art is a social act, is that connection with readers. So I've had the luck with Life of Pi of being deluged with letters. And some have been extremely touching. When people are complete strangers to you, from a different culture, from a different language, and they take your metaphor, your allegory, as their own. They appropriate the novel as their own. That's really very satisfying. You really feel you've connected with humanity somehow. You've done your job as a human being by connecting. It's like the consummation of love. You've actually connected with someone, and they happen to be complete strangers. And them reaching out to write, and I make myself inaccessible, so it's hard to get to me, because I don't want to be deluged. And these letters are really sometimes really battered, and they eventually get to me in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. You don't even know where that is. And you read these letters, and they're really very, very touching. And specifically the one in Life of Pi, there's a tiger, of course, and the number of people who've written to me and say, this or that in my life was a tiger. You know, I had a tumor, I had cancer, and while I was fighting this cancer, I thought of the cancer as a tiger, and I had to live with that tiger. That was the one they'd take on the most, and they'd tell me their little story, these strangers from 10,000 miles away. That was extremely satisfying.
This has been a very illuminating discussion, and now it is your turn to contribute something to it. We're going to take some questions. You, ma'am, there, yes. Yes, right here in front.
Hello. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Can you just say a bit more about the physical act of writing? I'm a calligrapher, so I'm very interested in that tactility of pen on paper, please. If you do use...
Well, I'll jump in. Álvaro writes with pen and paper. I write on a computer. I don't know why you wouldn't. But what's mildly interesting is I write on a treadmill desk. So I have a desk, I have a treadmill, I'm walking, and I have a desk at the height. And so I walk all day as I'm typing. So I'm not sitting all day long. So I'm very happy at my treadmill desk. I walk my 6 to 10 miles while I'm typing away. You can't use a mouse, you have to use a trackpad. But that's how I write. Physically, I'm walking as I'm writing. I'm a perambulating writer.
And for me, it is a very physical act. I don't actually do any exercise, and so the only time I really sweat is on a hot day in a public appearance or when I'm writing. Like before I came here, I had to borrow my wife's Secret. It's like an American deodorant, strong enough for a man but made for women. Because so when I work, I'm in a big fever and I'm sweating and I play music, loud music, and I'm getting into the music. And so that's my only exercise, is sweating at the desk, I guess.
Was that a bit of product placement you just had there?
That was $5 each time I say it. I'm very excited.
I don't have anything interesting to say. I can't write in longhand. I tried at the beginning, and I just couldn't believe anything that was in my own handwriting. It had to have the objectivity and authority of being in type. So there we are. And by the time I get to the desk, I'm so tired. There's no way I'm going to get on a treadmill as well. So.
It's so interesting. I have exactly the same feeling about the sort of distance and objectivity of type. There's a way, certainly editing, it has to be in type because you have to have that relationship of objectivity. But I take notes in longhand, and I have appalling writing. I mean, to the extent that my wife suggested that I was attempting to conceal my notes from the rest of the world to make it possible. If I lost a notebook, no one would be able to understand anything that was in there, even if it was my darkest, most unfiltered secrets. But there is something about thinking with a pen. I think that's important. And then there's something about assessing with a screen, maybe.
Yeah, it's a completely different process, but I write the books longhand completely from beginning to end in very specific notebooks with very specific pens. I'm a little bit ashamed about confessing this because it's like a maniac thing, you know? But there is this essential difference that I feel since I begin to write in notebooks, that is that there is something there, you know? The computer is very scary because there is nothing, you know? It's all an abstraction, you know? And you have there those children that you have to feed, and the house and the rent and the taxes, and there's nothing but a computer screen, no? Well, the notebooks look real. I take longer, I think, writing, because I write and then rewrite. And when everybody begins, I already spent 2 years working, no longhand, because I really write ugly longhand. No, it's not, the book is not there for sure. No? But it's a process that helps me, and it has to do a lot with the physical process of sitting down to write, as much as the process of reading. No, when I read, I had one of these electronic readers like for 10 minutes, and it was the most unsatisfying experience ever. No? I felt that I was not reading anything when I was reading in a Nook or in one. They are ugly.
Maybe someone from the back. Yes.
Thank you. I was really interested in the concept that you made on the archives. My question to any of the writers is, do you think a writer really needs to worry much about the archive, or do you think the archives could be necessarily left over to the historians?
Well, I don't think you worry about them. I think they're very useful to have if you're trying to write about a period other than your own. And so you browse through them and take what you want. And no, I don't think they should be left entirely to the historians, because I think that making imaginative use of them also brings them to life and makes them accessible, and their stories accessible to more people. So I think that it's good for writers to have a relationship with the archive, but it's a sort of loose, friendly relationship rather than a sort of constricting, troubling one.
I mean, I'd go back to Alvaro's point about sandals, and that there's the use of the archive as partly a kind of psychological one for the writer, is I need to feel that I know this place. I mean, whether that's true or not is a matter of debate, but there's a kind of comfort that allows you to express yourself and to think imaginatively within a world if you feel that you have the scaffolding of that kind of knowledge.
And there is the cabinet thing, you know. I'm sorry, did I interrupt? No. There is like the cabinet of antiquities thing in an archive. No, I have such a joyful and infantile relationship with the things I find in other books that I feel like I should share this. Yes. No? So I write novels with archive. No? My novels have the archive included always. No, just because it's fun, no? Or I found it fun. Maybe it's very boring.
We don't have a lot of time left. Whoever has the most interesting question in the audience, only that person raise your hand.
50 hands, the compliment.
Why don't we try with, yes.
This question is specifically for Hari Kunzru, sir. So I just wanted to know, what are the qualities which a reader needs to imbibe in himself or herself so that they can feel one with the writer while reading his or her creation?
But I just don't have that set of requirements from a reader. I'm just grateful.
Hi, this is from Mr. Whitehead. Do you feel, because I know you write in different genres, do you feel any external pressure, whether from your publicist, publishers, readers, or even critics, to label yourself as a certain kind of writer?
No, I mean, you know, I've been with the same publisher for 9 books, and I think when you take a debut by a black guy writing about elevator inspectors, you accept that he's a weirdo, and I've been lucky that my publishers accepted that I'm a weirdo from book to book. And they don't place any pressure on me. I think, you know, that's not the kind of person I am, and not the kind of person I want to work with. going to the earlier question about pop culture, it is important for me to change things up, and I think I realized early on that I take a lot of cues from TV and music and film, but I think like David Bowie and Stanley Kubrick, I sort of took their lessons in when I was young. Stanley Kubrick would do like his crime movie, his sci-fi movie, his horror movie. David Bowie would change persona from album to album. And that seemed like a way of being an artist. If you know how to do one kind of story, why repeat yourself? And so I switch it up because it makes the work vital for me.
Okay, one question at the back there, yes, and then we'll come to you next. The gentleman raising his hand at the back, yes.
Hi, thank you for a lovely discussion. Yann mentioned more than once that he didn't care so much if his sales were good or not, and that's great. But, and you all are relatively young authors. Do you think about your own legacies? How much do you think about what your legacy is going to be in the world of literature?
Your legacy?
I don't think about that at all. You're a very lucky writer if your book lasts 20 years. There are these sort of geniuses that last centuries, but I don't see what I gain by thinking about that. I'm incredibly lucky that I've done well. I never thought I'd become a writer. I studied philosophy at university. I just sort of started writing to pass the time until some finger would come from the sky and would say, you're going to be a dentist. That finger never came, so I just kept on writing, and I got slightly better and a lot luckier. And legacy, I don't really think about it. To be honest, I don't really care. I'm sort of in the present moment. I care about my children and their future. I care about having fun, satisfaction, working on what I'm working. But I aspire not to be one of those writers who's still trying to write a good novel when he's 77 years old. I'd like to sort of, if I have nothing to say, as it is, I don't have much to say. I haven't written that many books, considering I'm 55. So I aspire when I have nothing to say to just fall silent and do something else. And if people still read my book, great, but that's their decision, and I don't particularly think about it.
Okay, yes, you.
Hello, and thank you for the wonderful session. I just wanted to know how much of yourself as people do you find in your own books? Is it a struggle to, keep the person, the man, the woman out of your novel, to adopt an objective perspective as such? Do you struggle with that? I mean, when I'm reading Life of Pi, do I see Yann Martel somewhere there? Or when I'm reading Underground Railroad, do I see you there? And that's what I want to know.
I guess for me, sometimes I'm in my books a lot, and sometimes not at all. Sometimes I am drawing from my own personality for the main character or the supporting cast, people I know. With the Underground Railroad, Cora is the least like me, which is probably why it's my most popular book.
I'm very little tempted by the autobiographical. All my books are sort of constructs, artifices, and my first novel, Self, looks a bit like my life, but it's completely untrue. There's a twist in it that shows that it can't be biographical. So I'm not interested in my own life. I look out. I'm a seeing eye. I looking out, and I don't like looking in. I'm not interested. So there's very, very little that's autobiographical. In Life of Pi, for example, the only autobiographical element that jumps out is I think Pi at one point says that green is his favorite color. I kind of like green. But that's really it. Everything else is just invention.
I'm slightly the opposite. I find fiction is a very good screen behind which you can do a lot of personal exploration and personal work. And I think I need that distance of making characters who are very clearly not me in ordinary biographical terms, but have some kind of ability when I'm writing a novel, I am doing a kind of personal work as well as the work of trying to tell a story to a reader.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all that we have time for, since I can see there's only 10 seconds left on the clock. But ladies and gentlemen, life is very rarely so exciting on a Saturday morning, so a big hand for a good show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chandrahas.